Trump announced that he is revoking temporary protected status for all Somali migrants in Minnesota. Turns out Minnesota Somalis were allegedly stealing millions of dollars, all while Minnesota Governor Tim Walz was running for vice president on the Democratic ticket. Not only did Tim Walz not investigate the alleged fraud, he allegedly actively punished those who called attention to it. Even the New York Times is addressing this now in a piece called How Fraud Swamped Minnesota's Social Services System on Tim Walz's Watch. That's how you know it's bad. The story here is twofold. Kamala Harris's running mate allegedly allowed major corruption in his state, and it was allegedly orchestrated by members of the Somali diaspora in Minnesota, a group with growing political power because America admitted migrants that it turns out do not want to assimilate. Let's lock in. According to law enforcement officials, over the last 5 years, many Minnesota Somalis made bank by creating companies that charge state agencies millions of dollars worth of social services. Let me break it down again. Alleged fraudsters made shell companies, in other words, fronts, claiming to provide social services to needy Minnesotans.
Services? Oh, services.
Neither the company nor the product was real, and then they requested reimbursement from the state government for these fake services, which the state government happily paid out. This was classic money laundering. One organization called Feeding Our Futures was robbed, allegedly.
Allegedly.
To the tune of $1 billion. And it was, allegedly, Minnesota Somalis who did the stealing. Federal prosecutors have now charged dozens of people with felonies, accusing them of stealing hundreds of millions from a government program that was meant to feed kids during the pandemic. Feeding Our Futures was supposed to cost Minnesota $2.6 million when it started in 2020. So then tell me how it grew to cost over $104 million last year. Well, the nonprofit used $250 million in federal funds to purchase luxury cars, houses, jewelry, and coastal resort property abroad. And for years, under Tim Walz, the Minnesota Department of Education ignored the red flags about this nonprofit. The last review of the nonprofit was in 2018, and while it found serious issues, including that it did not collect enrollment information from sites, Walz's administration did not follow up. And they found other problems. The nonprofit didn't have a dedicated accounting staff. Staff salaries were above average. Between June 2018 and December 2021, the department received more than 30 complaints about the organization, from unethical practices to demanding kickbacks from vendors. Not much of this was probed, and it got worse. Another state program offered therapy to autistic children.
Hassan is accused of recruiting and bribing parents to bring their kids to her autism center for services they did not need.
Prosecutors said one organization recruited children in Minneapolis's Somali community and falsely certified them as qualifying for autism treatment and paid their Somali parents kickbacks for their cooperation. Prosecutors have so far charged Asha Farhan Hassan, 29 years old, with wire fraud. They say that she and business partners stole $14 million from autistic kids, or fake autistic kids. Hassan is Somali. 78 out of 86 people charged in the meals, housing, and autism therapy fraud cases are Somali, though the majority are American citizens by birth or naturalization. But there's more. Take Minnesota's Medicaid Housing Stabilization Services Program. It was supposed to help seniors, addicts, the disabled, the mentally ill get housing, but a few holes. It had minimal requirements for reimbursement, aka it was ripe for fraud. On October 1st, Minnesota's Department of Human Services said that payment to 77 housing stabilization providers that the program had worked with were terminated this year due to, quote, credible allegations of fraud. In September, criminal indictments for HHS fraud were announced against 6 Minnesota Somalis. The signs were there. Just like with Feeding Our Futures, the original budget for this housing program was a modest $2.6 million. By 2021, it paid out over $21 million in claims. Then it went to $42 million, then $74, then 104. During the first 6 months of this past year, payouts totaled $61 million. Where was all that money going? To these alleged fraudsters from the Minnesota Somali community. A Minnesota prosecutor said, quote, most of these cases, unlike a lot of Medicare fraud and Medicaid fraud cases nationally, they're not just overbilling. These are often just purely fictitious companies solely created to defraud the system, and that's unique in the extent to which we have that here in Minnesota. This prosecutor said that many firms enrolled in the program operated out of dilapidated storefronts or rundown office buildings, so like literally a front. And the perpetrators often targeted people recently released from rehab, signing them up for Medicaid services they had no intention of providing. So this is preying on the most vulnerable in our society to make a quick buck, a big buck. And according to this prosecutor, many owners of companies engaged in HHS fraud had other companies through which they billed other Medicaid programs, such as the EIDBI Autism program, the Adult Rehab Mental Health Services program, the Integrated Community Support program, the Community Access for Disability Inclusion. I'm out of breath, but they scammed, allegedly, a lot of programs in the Minnesota state government, paid for by the taxpayers. This is a very messy web of corruption. The Feeding Our Future scam that I mentioned at the beginning was the largest COVID aid fraud scheme in the country. And while these fraudsters were busy skimming, allegedly, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz was bouncing around the campaign trail with Kamala Harris. There was a tweet from an account claiming to represent Minnesota Department of Human Services employee whistleblowers, over 480 of them allegedly, who said that Walz is to blame for the fraud in his state. The tweet said, Tim Walz is 100% responsible for massive fraud in Minnesota. We let Tim Walz know of fraud early on, hoping for a partnership and stopping fraud, but no, we got the opposite response. Tim Walz systematically retaliated against whistleblowers using monitoring, threats, repression, and did his best to discredit fraud reports. Instead of partnership, we got the full weight of retaliation by Tim Walz, certain DFL members, and in different mainstream media. It's scary, isolating, and left us wondering who we can turn to. But that account keeps getting suspended, so I can't be sure of the authenticity of the account, but it is suspicious. It leads us to ask more questions. If Tim Walz wasn't involved in a cover-up, he was at least absent, MIA, during this whole scandal, and he let it unfold because he was trying to win that VP spot. But let's go back for a moment. I know what you've been thinking. How did Somalis get to Minnesota in the first place? For decades, our immigration policy has favorably treated Somalis relative to other groups. They've been coming here since the 1990s, when a civil war in that country drove an exodus of tens of thousands of refugees here. And Minnesota has a really generous safety net, kind of like the Scandinavian countries, supported by high taxes, of course, and that's attractive to immigrants. The left is trying to say now that this was some fluke corruption committed by a few foreigners, and that we shouldn't condemn or alienate the whole Somali community.
Minnesota is a generous state. Minnesota is a prosperous state, a well-run state. We're AAA bond rated, but that attracts criminals. Those people are going to jail. We're doing everything we can, but to demonize an entire community on the actions of a few, it's lazy.
But in light of this story, let's ask ourselves, does welcoming unfettered numbers of Somalis into Minnesota serve our national interest? According to the Manhattan Institute, Somalis have enormously high unemployment rates. Minneapolis's Little Mogadishu is the center of the nation's largest concentration of Somalis. Most terrifying, federal authorities have considered that area a hotspot for recruiting new fighters to Islamic terrorist groups in the smack middle of North America. In 2010, under the Obama administration, 12 individuals, including 5 U.S. citizens, were charged with acts of terrorism that included providing money, personnel, and other material support to Islamic terror group al-Shabaab, which is a long-standing ally of al-Qaeda. The indictments charged individuals in Alabama, California, and you guessed it, Minnesota. Federal counterterrorism sources say that millions of dollars in the stolen funds from The fraud schemes we've been talking about were sent back to Somalia, where they ultimately landed in the hands of al-Shabaab. So the Minnesota taxpayer might just not be bankrolling a bunch of Somalis to live high on the hog. They might be subsidizing terrorism, both homegrown and abroad. Tim Walz said taking the crimes of a few and generalizing about an entire group is lazy, but I think it's a little lazy to pretend not to notice. 78 out of 86 alleged fraudsters? That is, rather statistically significant. But what do you think? Do you agree with Trump's decision to move to suspend the TPS status for Somalis to Minnesota? Because it seems we have a assimilation problem here. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And make sure you like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell so that you never miss out on future content.